Welcome back to the Cruise Elite Podcast. Tony, what's going on, man?
Good morning.
You're in recovery, kind of, huh?
Good word. I am in recovery. I got sick last week. This is like, I don't know, maybe this is interesting, maybe this is not. But it was just like a sore throat, and I felt kind of lousy, but, I could muddle through. And then on Thursday, I had a podcast in the morning and a gig at night, and I had to stop by to do a repair at another spot in between. So all that to say, I was like a little sick, but I was like, okay, I just got to get through this day and I'll be good. The next day, it was like I got hit by a truck.
Oof.
And so it was like a reverse sickness where then it got worse each day after that. So I'm finally coming out on the other end, but I don't know
rough.
if I'm getting old or if it's just like the bugs are different now in 2024 and 5.
Maybe. Luckily, I haven't been taken down by anything yet. But you know what? For me, in the winter, when it happens, it's usually like an end of the winter, early spring kind of thing for me. Yeah.
See, that's nice. You can actually plan on it. I feel like I get sick pretty frequently. So
yeah, I kind of had a year like that last year. Last year, towards the end of the winter, was tough for me. I had several colds, but so far so good, right now. But you know what's interesting? You've probably experienced this. Sounds like you may have recently. It's almost like your body knows when you're really busy and you have a lot to do, and you don't get taken down. And then as soon as you have a moment to rest, it's like your system just knows, oh, this is my chance. And then you're just out for the count, and you have to surrender.
Yeah, no, that's happened to me multiple times. I wonder if there's like a neuro link there somewhere.
Yeah.
Do you know any underlying science around that? Or?
Not really, except that I don't know if I read it or heard it on a podcast. Somebody was talking about like how your sympathetic nervous system gets really revved up when you have like an incoming cold, like as soon as your immune system begins to be stressed. And I do wonder if like that's kind of what happens is you're essentially going on stress hormones, right? As almost like a false energy, and you're go. And, adrenaline works awesome, allows you to do stuff at a fast pace. I wonder if that's part of it, but I don't really know a lot about it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, in live events, live events and stress go hand in hand. There's just time crunches and there's stuff to do and things are going wrong and you have to troubleshoot in real time. And it's always amazing to me where it's like I might be feeling kind of lousy, but in the moment, you just turn it on and you make it happen, and then you pay for it later.
Right. Yeah. I've had that happen many times.
Right on, man. How have you been?
I've been good. I'm busy, especially today's a busy day because we have this podcast, but today is actually my last live call with the Neuro Dojo group that we have. So it was a fast, at least it seemed like a fast 16 weeks.
Yeah.
So here we are on the last call today. And today's really just kind of a wrap-up call. We're going to be talking about a lot of the material that we've covered over the last 16 weeks, but also going over health history. One of the things that we wanted to add for this group in this round of the Neuro Dojo is a little bit more insight on how to take a more thorough history, because taking a person's history becomes one of your most important assessment strategies. And we had never really taken the time to go through it in a really thoughtful way. So today, what we've had people do is submit either a history for themselves or a history from a client that they're working with. And we're just going to go through it as a group and kind of highlight things that stand out and then kind of connect that back to some of the neurology. And then, of course, some of the types of drills that we might use or assessments that we might use for those particular things. So it should be good.
That's awesome. And I'm sure everyone listening has already heard our podcast, 2 podcasts on taking a history. But if you haven't, feel free to go back and check those out so you can know what he's talking about. Any highlights or lowlights from this Neuro Dojo season?
You know what? It's been really solid. The group has been awesome. I've been really impressed. There's been a lot of good dialogue. There's been people who have taken the plunge and started applying material immediately, which is always very difficult. It takes a lot of courage, especially when you're a health or movement professional and you're learning something completely new. that is sort of perceived by others as weird because of how different it is,
Mm-hmm.
it's really difficult to have the courage to start to apply it. And so I always am encouraging people to do that once they feel comfortable enough. Before that, it's all about doing enough yourself with your own body so that you can have those experiences, learn. That usually helps people feel more comfortable at applying it or teaching it to somebody else. So I thought this group did a really wonderful job with that. So I'm excited about that. So yeah, it's been all positive the whole time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so great. Well, congratulations to all of the Neuro Dojo members
Yes.
for this round. Yeah,
graduates, I guess we would call them.
Graduates.
Yeah.
Do they get like a little
We don't have
certificate or
anything right
something?
now,
Yeah.
but maybe in the future we should do something like that. I think
Yeah.
piece of paper with like a ninja on it.
Yeah,
a
that'd be
ninja
fun.
and a ninja in a brain.
Yeah. Nice. Cool, man. So what are we talking about today?
Well, let's see. So we talked about hitting up some ideas around recovery strategies,
Mm-hmm.
right? But then what happened was I actually got injured. And when you and I talked, it was like, well, we want to talk about recovery strategies. Why don't we actually go over that story of what happened? Because I injured my knee a few weeks ago. And that will kind of be part of the discussion and also a segue into other things that might come up around this idea of recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And specifically, I think what's really intriguing to me in this story, and we'll get into it, is how quickly things can happen.
Mm-hmm.
And basically focusing on that short term, what happens right after an injury and what can you do?
Right.
You know, we talk a lot in this podcast about chronic injury or chronic
Pain, really.
pain.
Yeah.
But I think it would be really cool to focus on the immediate, short term, rapid stage of recovery and what happens there and what can be done and what's different about it.
Yeah. That's great. So we'll get right into the story. So, and let me start it by saying I'm currently sitting here with no knee pain, which is great. My injury wasn't anything that I think was too serious, so that's good. But it had me tricked for a little while. So what happened was about 3 weeks ago, we had a local jiu-jitsu seminar. And it was actually something that I put together, meaning somebody that I know who is a really amazing practitioner and instructor of jiu-jitsu. Also, he's a pro guy. He lives local, and he's actually one of my fly fishing buddies.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and I actually haven't known him for that long, but we talk a lot about fishing conditions, and I see him on the river sometimes, and we occasionally make plans to get out there together. So he just happens to be this amazing jiu-jitsu practitioner. I actually met him in my favorite secret fishing spot. And I saw this guy who I'd never seen before, and he had a big swollen cauliflower ear. And I was like, hey, how'd you get that ear? Of course, I know how he got that ear, but it was a serious ear, right? Yeah. So when you see somebody who's like a long-time grappler, sometimes they have like pretty crazy cauliflower ear. So we started talking about grappling and wrestling and jiu-jitsu and stuff, and come to find out he's a pro. So
it was bromance at first sight.
Yeah, yep. So I got him in touch with my instructor, and he came down on a Saturday 3 weeks ago and put on kind of a mini seminar, like a 2-hour thing.
Cool.
Yeah, and so I was the guinea pig, meaning like the person that he was demonstrating all the techniques on. And it was great. We learned a ton, a lot of good stuff to add to my game. And of course, I drew the short straw basically when it came time to have live rounds and roll, which means like actual, live wrestling. And, my instructor was just smiling at me, and he's like, hey, you're the one who brought him here. You take him first. And I've rolled with him before. It's a lot of fun. He's just like, when you roll with somebody who's at that level, their recognition of positions and techniques is at such a high level. It's a bizarre feeling. It's different. It's very different. It's hard to explain, but it is a really good experience to have when you're trying to learn. So I drew that short straw and we started rolling. And like 2 minutes into it, he basically went to sweep me, which is a technique where if the opponent is on the mat sitting on their butt
Mm-hmm.
and the other person is standing up, he was the one on the mat, and his goal would be to sweep me, which takes me off my feet,
Mm-hmm.
basically sits me back down to the mat, and then, he can work up into a more dominant position. So he went to sweep me, and sometimes sweeps require like a certain entanglement of the legs.
Yeah.
And I went to step over his leg, and his sweep kind of became more of like a kick,
Mm-hmm.
and it caught the very bottom portion of my right leg.
Oof.
So that, and it was weird, man. It was like, it caught me right at the exact moment that I was stepping over his leg, or trying to at least, when my leg was super relaxed. And I think that was kind of like one of the reasons why this turned into an injury. So he caught me with his leg, and it essentially sent my knee kind of inward at a sharp
Mm-hmm.
angle
Mm-hmm.
right as I was relaxed. And so it put a tremendous amount of stress on my MCL, and it actually popped. It actually went, click. Now, I didn't hear it, but I felt it.
Yeah.
And I was like, son of a, because I know this because I've injured it before. Years ago in college wrestling, I sprained my MCL. And then about 7 years ago, when I was first starting jujitsu, I had an MCL injury.
And
So
is
this
this
is
on
not,
that same, I think you're right-sided prone to injury, or?
yeah, I have been over the years.
Uh-huh. Was
Not
this on the right side?
This
Or?
was on the right side. Yep, right
Interesting.
MCL. And so it caught me just right. I got the pop, and I continued to roll because it didn't feel that serious, but in my mind I was thinking about it, and that's fine because I got destroyed so fast anyways by my friend Sean here that we were resetting, and I was saved by a bloody ear because in that process, I think his knee brace caught a piece of my ear when he
Mm-hmm.
threw in an arm bar.
Mm-hmm.
And we basically reset. And he was like, "Oh, your ear's bleeding." And I was like, "Oh, hang on." So I went over to the bathroom, got cleaned up, came back. I was like, "Hey, my ear's not going to stop bleeding right now." And so we ended up stopping that roll. And in the back of my mind, I was like, "Geez, I hope my knee's okay."
Mm-hmm.
So walking out of there, I knew that it was probably a sprain. I just didn't know how bad. And, so I'm just kind of going through the motions, thinking about it. I text my wife, Alicia, and I'm like, "Yeah, so much for putting this thing together. I actually just got injured." She's like, "Oh, no, I don't know how bad yet." So about 4 hours goes by, and it's starting to get that kind of acute stage feeling of stiffness and swelling
Mm-hmm.
with some increased pain.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of knew at that point that something more serious happened.
So before that, the adrenaline's going.
Yep.
You felt the pop, but otherwise, you're walking, everything feels okay?
I know something happened because there's that internal feeling of something's not right.
Okay.
There's an initial lack of confidence and weakness that comes with that. But you're right, because your adrenaline is pumping with an injury like that, you often don't feel a lot of pain necessarily until some of that kind of wears off. But I knew from experience that this was at least a low-grade sprain.
Mm-hmm.
So as I started to feel that stiffening up, I started just doing some local work like knee circles. I was just trying to manage it a little bit by moving. And I just kind of kept doing really small range of motion knee circles. And it kind of helped manage some of the discomfort that I was starting to feel. Certainly wasn't performing miracles, but I've always been a believer that even with an acute stage injury, if you can create small movements, call them micro movements, if you will, it's a good idea to do that. As long as you don't feel like you're exacerbating any of the pain that you're having. And it wasn't increasing my pain or anything. If anything, it was actually decreasing it just from the movement. So that's kind of where it all started for me, is I would every about, 20 minutes or so, I'd probably do about 5 knee circles in each direction.
So pain is your sort of litmus test here. If you're causing pain, don't do the movement, but...
Yeah. If it hurts,
Okay.
I would say reduce the range of motion.
Okay.
And you might end up doing something that you think is kind of silly because it's such a regressed version of what you might normally be able to do, but that's okay. You actually want to regress it enough so that you don't feel like you're doing anything threatening.
Yeah. So why is this the first thing that you're doing? What are you getting out of these knee circles?
So, assuming that you're not making anything worse, you are starting to kind of tell your brain that you are safe, right? You're kind of just because there's a lot of perceived threat that starts to build up after you've been injured.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot to be said for just starting to do some gentle movement that can help reduce some of that threat. But also, you're getting a lot of kind of inflammatory things going on now locally. And so beginning to sort of manage some of those fluid dynamics with movement is a very good thing to do as soon as possible and ongoing.
Yeah. Because inflammation's going to happen around injuries, right? Like it's going
It
to
is.
swell. Inflammation is part of the healing process, right?
It is.
So what are you doing when you're talking about managing inflammation or managing that fluid? What does that mean? Are you trying to reduce it?
You're helping your body process it, and it's going to come back, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's going to come back. It used to be that we were really hyper fixated on trying to eliminate inflammation and swelling.
Right. Like take some
yeah,
ibuprofen or aspirin or whatever.
Yeah, and do things that we're supposed to eliminate it. And right
Ice
now,
packs.
yeah, elevate, all that stuff. Compression, which I did use some compression just because it felt good, and I used it because it was decreasing perceived threat. Because we had errands to run that day, and we went out as a family. And this was now about 4 hours after the seminar, and I was beginning to hobble around. Like I was now starting to be like, "Come on!" Like I even said to Alicia, "I'm like, this is because I've felt this before. I'm like, this is going to be 3 months." And then at one point that day, I was like, this might be 5 months because sprains can be nasty. And it was starting to hurt a lot. So I was like, you got to be kidding me. Like, how did this come from something that didn't seem that traumatic? I was having a pretty intense response to that. So I put compression on it next. We had errands to run. We actually went out for like a brunch that day too. I took a compression wrap, just like an ace bandage. And actually, I dug it out of a box I haven't been in years. It's kind of cool. I had these old, they're actually tourniquets. They're military grade tourniquets that I use like voodoo floss. If you remember like the tourniquets that you wrap around your joints. This is a little bit different though, because it was an ace bandage, but what it has is a little additional air bladder that you pump up manually with this little hand pump. And it's kind of cool. So if you were to put this around a wound, you could then slip the air bladder inside the ace bandage and pump it up to create more compression. See, I used to use these with clients when I did a lot more face-to-face work with people, because one of the techniques that I would do, or one of the assessments I would do sometimes, is on people's trunk or their abdomen and thorax, where we're doing more manual types of work where we apply pressure to people's body. And it actually is a good way to stimulate the vagus nerve and a different brain area that we talk a lot about in our courses called the insula. So by creating that tactile stimulus with pressure anywhere on the trunk or abdomen, you can do some really neat things training that part of the brain. So I had these because I used to wrap them around people's trunk and then slip the air bladder in there and pump it up so that it provided like a 1/2 inch of pressure into their skin. I used that on my knee. So I put the ace bandage around my knee, slipped the air bladder in, pumped it up, and I tested. We've talked about directional specificity.
Yep.
When you wrap something around your body, whether it's some kind of ace bandage, voodoo floss, honestly, anything, even kinesio tape, you need to test directions. I tested directional specificity and found that when I took the ace bandage and wrapped it inwardly, so if it was me putting it on, I wrapped from right to left. And that was
outside of the knee to the inside.
Exactly. Yeah. And then I put that air bladder in there and I pumped it up, and it was a combination of pressure on my MCL, which was helping it feel a little bit better, and that torsion or that skin traction to the inside. And I assessed it with some range of motion and just bending my knee, and it decreased my pain a little bit. So I was like, okay, cool. So here's something I can do in this acute stage already that will help give me this sense of joint stability with decreased pain And in my mind, that's just a really good way to reduce some of that initial perceived threat.
Yeah. Two questions. So
Mhm.
one, you tested the directionality of the wrap going inwards. Did you also test the other way or
Yeah, I did.
after assessing? Okay.
I
So you
ended up,
test both.
yep, I tested both. I got worse on the other one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wrapped it outwardly. And when I wrapped it outwardly, for whatever reason, my nervous system didn't like that direction of
The
skin
way it was
stretch.
pulling.
Exactly.
Yeah. That happened to
Exactly.
me as well when I did that. It was like pretty obvious too. Like this is making it less comfortable
Mhm.
and this is not. So
It's a really good thing to know, and it is literally that simple. You just test each direction, and then you test movement and pain, and you see.
mhm,
And it's
mhm.
wild how specific your nervous system is in regard to direction of skin traction. It's a receptor-based kind of thing, and it's exactly the same kind of way of thinking is how I teach people to apply different forms of manual work,
Mhm.
because you can actually test the direction. Kinesiotape, same thing. Test the direction, and you can get much better results when you do that.
Yeah. No, that's great. So the difference here between like some type of wrap, some type of compression versus like a cast. And
Hmm.
I know that like the casts are usually used for broken bones, but
Hmm.
just for sake of comparison,
Yep.
it seems to me that one still allows movement of the joint
Right.
and supports it, and one just completely disables the joint.
Totally. I mean, let's say I didn't know what I know and I
Mhm,
freaked out even more. Not saying I
mhm,
didn't freak out. I had
mhm.
my moment. I got pissed. I couldn't believe it. I thought I was going to be out for, 3, 5 months.
Yeah.
But let's say I had just gone to the doctor right away.
Mhm.
It's likely that I would have been in more of a brace that
Right.
immobilized my knee from moving, because
Yeah.
that's common practice. That's kind of standard procedure. I don't think that's a good idea unless it's absolutely necessary. This wasn't a serious injury, but
Mhm.
I don't believe that stopping a person from movement is the answer. I always tell people, because especially when I've worked with young athletes and they have some kind of injury, of course they go through the rounds, they go to the doctor, they end up with a brace that's supposed to immobilize them from moving. And they're like, now what? And I educate them and say, you know what? You don't want to have this brace on all day long because you need to be moving, right? To support your body in the healing process and deal with the fluids. When I do want you to wear the brace, it's because I want you to protect your injury from other people.
Mm.
So going out into public all of a sudden becomes very unpredictable. Sometimes your environment becomes unpredictable, especially for like a student athlete who's going to be at school and stuff. I
Yeah,
always
that's
say,
always.
yeah, seriously. Your buddy comes up, thinks it's a good idea to kick you in the knee, doesn't know you have an injury. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what it was like for me in high school. So you want to protect yourself when you need to. So in that scenario, I think a brace of some kind that does immobilize you or at least protect you in some way is very useful. Outside of that, we have to move. We got to get as much movement as possible and do it in a thoughtful way, a careful way that's not exacerbating issues.
Okay, very cool. So it's still day one at
Yep.
this point. You're running errands. It
Yeah.
hurts. You wrap it with this air compression.
Yep.
You've been doing knee circles periodically.
Yeah. Every time I sit down and stand back up, the stiffness is back, the pain is
Mhm.
increased. I do some knee circles now with the compression on my knee. That gives me a very short term kind of high payoff result where I have now more mobility in my knee and less pain. And so that's what I'm doing now every, say, 20 minutes or so.
Mhm.
So I'm hobbling around, going through our day, doing our errands, and I get home, and now things are really starting to get stiff. What I decided to do right away was some red light therapy. So I have a red light. I've had it for years. It's nothing special. Red light therapy now is so advanced. You can
Mm.
get some really amazing devices. I have a very old one, but I've used it for a long time with pretty good success. And so all that is me laying on the couch. I've got my knee up slightly elevated and I'm putting some red light on it. So it's very passive, just a time to relax, kind of offload my knee, get some red light on it.
So what is the red light doing?
So it's a dense science that I definitely don't know everything about. The more and more I learn, it's like, wow, there's a lot here. But basically, it's going to encourage regeneration of tissue. And depending on the frequency or the part of the light spectrum, I think it's measured in nanometers, if I remember correctly. The different parts of that red light spectrum are going to penetrate to a certain level of tissue depth.
Sure.
That's what you read anyway.
Yeah.
And so my light falls somewhere, gosh, I don't even know if I fully remember. It might be around like 750 to 850 nanometers, something in that ballpark. It might be a little bit off, but so by putting the red light on, it starts to encourage tissue regeneration. It's very soothing. Mine actually is warm as well. And it felt good, right? So it's not something that in acute stage necessarily performs miracles, but I have used it very consistently in the past, both for myself and for clients. And I really do feel like it can accelerate healing when there's been some kind of tissue damage. I've had clients use it on sprains, strains, fractures.
Mm-hmm.
I really do think it's quite useful. Again, it's not performing miracles, but it's a tool in the toolbox, and it seems like a legit one.
So it's just stimulating the cells to do what they were going to do anyways, but maybe a little faster, or
Yeah.
is that kind of the idea?
Yeah. And I actually, probably my best success with the red light personally was 2 years ago. I had the only hematoma I've ever had. I nailed my, basically the very bottom of my IT band, like right where it attaches near my knee.
Mm-hmm.
I nailed it on the wrestling mat. We have a very hard mat, and I caught it at the right angle and it bruised me, which happens pretty commonly in wrestling and jiu-jitsu. But then I hit the same spot about 10 more times. And I ended up with a nasty hematoma. And I used a combination of red light therapy and kinesiotape, actually. I did what's called a lymphatic application of kinesiotape, where you actually cut the tape a very specific way. When I teach people to do it, I say you're basically cutting out what looks like a squid. It's like kind of a rounded tab to the end of the tape, and then it has legs. And you cut strips in the tape, maybe 6 to 8 strips. And you take the tab end, that becomes your anchor, and you apply that to the skin without any stretch to the tape. But you do it near an area of the body that has a high concentration of lymph nodes. So if we're talking about the leg, that could be the back of the knee, because there's some lymph nodes back there. It could also be the crease of the hip. There's a lot of lymph nodes in the crease of the hip. And so for me, I put the tag end, I guess we'd call it, the anchor, and I put that near my hip crease. And then what you do is you take each leg of the tape and you apply maybe a 25% stretch to the leg, and you peel off the back and you run it down your leg, kind of in like a pattern, right? Like oftentimes the way you do it, it kind of looks like an S pattern.
Okay.
And each leg kind of runs next to the next one. And what happens is, because you are putting about 25% stretch on the kinesio tape, as soon as you lay down all of the legs of the tape, it's providing a little bit of pull against your skin back towards the anchor, which is at the lymph node site. And what you're essentially doing there, when you put kinesio tape on the skin and you create that skin stretch, every time you move the skin, you create some level of what I guess we would call a pressure differential underneath all that stuff in the body. And that encourages fluid to move. And so what you're doing there is you are encouraging fluid to move back towards that lymph site. And because the tape is on you passively, now you're walking around, maybe you're working out, maybe you're pedaling the stationary bike, whatever you're doing, you're now getting constant skin traction, which is constantly encouraging movement of fluids that might be accumulating at that injury site. That's how I got rid of my hematoma. It was the only thing that was effective. It was really good. And I would combine that with the red light. So
Interesting.
yeah, so we got on the hematoma tangent there, but we're back to my right MCL sprain. I used the red light and I did that several times the first 2 days. And it felt better. It soothed it. It wasn't performing miracles by any
Mm-hmm.
stretch of the imagination, but it felt productive.
Mm-hmm.
It felt productive. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Going back to the squid tape.
Yep. That's a lymphatic. That is essentially a lymphatic kinesiotape kind of setup.
So I'm wondering, there's probably some types of massage that
Definitely.
could also perform a similar function of
Totally.
just kind of helping work the fluid
Yeah.
back towards the lymph node.
Yeah, most manual therapists are trained in some kind of lymphatic type massage,
Mm-hmm.
and oftentimes they're doing the same thing that I just described. They're just doing it with their hands.
Yeah,
Yeah,
actively as opposed to it
you got it
being
exactly,
kind of passive. That's very cool.
and that's very effective. That's a good thing to do. The value of doing this with kinesiotape is that now you have a passive way to apply it for hours. See, that's why kinesiotape can be so amazing. People don't realize this. They think kinesiotape is a fad. I think originally people first saw kinesiotape because the women's volleyball players in the Olympics, I don't know, in the mid 2000s or whatever, early 2000s had it on. People were like, what are they wearing? Like, is that like a design? Like, are they wearing that like a tattoo? Like, what is that stuff? And now, of course, it's more popular. But a lot of people still don't realize how effective kinesiotape is. And the reason is when you put something on the skin like that and you create some kind of sensory stimulus, your nervous system responds to that immediately. If you know how to test direction,
Right.
it can be very effective. And then you have this passive stimulus that's ongoing for several hours or even several days. That's why it can be so effective. Whereas if you go to a manual therapist that does some manual work, you have that done to you for 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever. That might give you a good result. But now you don't have a passive stimulus for the next 2 days walking out of there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And testing, assessing with any of these interventions is going to be key, because what you don't want is something passively aggravating it.
Yeah. So that's the next thing.
Right?
That's the next thing. So,
okay.
So first morning after this injury, I woke up, and as you would expect, after an acute injury to a ligament, I was unbelievably stiff. And I was prepared for this because I've experienced it so many times in the past. But one of the problems with going to bed and trying to get good sleep after you've had an injury like this is that you're essentially in a static stretch for the whole night if you don't have it supported. So it becomes very uncomfortable, hard to find a position that works for sleeping. You can lose a lot of sleep in this stage of the healing game at nighttime if you've experienced this before. And so there were times at night that I kind of woke up because I had a lot of discomfort from being in a static stretch, because guess what? You don't want to statically stretch and overstretch injury. Mm-hmm. And that's what this is an overstretch injury. So I had some pillows underneath my knee, and I actually took a blanket and kind of rolled it up. And then I took that and rolled it around my knee so that it was still mobile. It was just supported so that if I did roll onto my side or something and my knees were kind of stacked up together, it wasn't enough force to like push me into an aggressive static stretch that caused a lot of discomfort. So that was quite useful. But when I woke up that next morning, I was still stiff as heck. So I basically made it from the kitchen with a cup of coffee to the couch. And I was just, bummed out, because now it's like the day after. You're going through the mental game. You're like, how long is this going to be? This seems more serious. What can I do? Because I got to get this day started. And basically right now I can't move. So I was like, I'm going to go get my e-stim unit, and I'm going to see if I can put some electrical stimulation on this thing and get anywhere. Because in the past, I've had success using electrical stimulation with certain injuries, but not really ligaments. It's actually something that I've used with more success when you have like a muscle overstretch type injuries or tendon issues. But I was like, whatever, we'll give it a shot. I did some e-stim on the knee. It felt fine as I was doing it. It was more just distracting me
Mm-hmm.
from the pain. And it did feel good to have the local muscles contracting from the e-stim. But when I was done with it and I stood up and tested it, I was like, nope, that is not productive in the moment.
So I'm sort of gleaning from your description, because I'm actually not familiar with this
Sure.
tech, that e-stim is you're
Yeah.
applying some sort of electricity to the
Yeah.
muscle, and it's going to contract when you do that.
Yeah. So e-stim is something that people probably have experienced if you've done more traditional physical therapy.
Interesting.
That's, when you're at the PT, you're laying on the table and they wheel over the little kiosk and there's a machine sitting on the kiosk, and then they put these electrode pads on your skin, sometimes 2 of them, sometimes 4 of them. But the idea is you would put the electrodes kind of below and above the site of injury. The whole idea being to get the muscles around the painful area to contract.
Mm-hmm.
Another passive form of stimulus that sometimes can be quite useful for, again, dealing with fluid dynamics, swelling, that kind of thing, and sometimes can be really good for pain management. It's just that in my case, when I retested it, I stood up, I moved around on my knee, and I was like, no, that didn't help me at all.
Yeah.
So that was something that I did not do again.
Yeah, no, good stuff. Good to know. I kind of see a commonality with that and just micro movement.
Mhm.
And just getting movement in general is you're working those muscles. Maybe there's not the range of motion component, which can be helpful if movement is causing pain, right?
Yeah.
But you're still getting stimulation there and working the tissue.
Totally. And so a lot of people will use that tool after, let's say, like a surgery. So you've had a surgery, you can't really move after that, and so the e-stim can be a way to create some activity in that area until you're safe to move on your own. And in that scenario, it can be quite useful.
Yeah.
For pain management, it can be too. I was just thinking of an instance maybe about 3 years ago. I pulled my my hip flexor. I think it was jujitsu. I just had like a strain in my hip flexor.
Jiu-jitsu is just so
dude,
so safe,
Yeah,
so,
it's just like they call it the gentle art, and it's like, what? Like, it is not feeling gentle. I pulled my hip flexor and I did the e-stim, and I went from like completely debilitated to walking with no pain in like, I don't know, I think I did 3 applications of the e-stim for 15 minutes, and this was all in the same day. And I went from like, I really can't do anything to, this is crazy, I have no pain, I'm fine. And so that in that scenario, it can be quite useful. Again, that was more of like a muscle overstretch type injury. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you assessed, this assessment showed that this was actually making it worse and not better. And so you discarded that protocol.
Yeah. I'm looking for things that make a noticeable difference. I wouldn't say that it necessarily made me that much worse, but the pain hadn't improved and I still felt really stiff. And I was just like, I'm looking for things that are going to reduce perceived threat and start to help, move the needle in the right direction. This isn't doing that. I'm going to put this down.
Okay.
Yeah. So, it was back to knee circles, and then I applied more red light therapy. I used that compression again one more day, the second day, and those were my tools at the moment.
Mm-hmm. So what's realistic at this juncture? Because you're still in pain, you're still swollen, I'm guessing. Your movement's probably still compromised.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing things that feel better, but it's not actually taking everything away.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know you're on the right track?
Listen, at this point, I'm still having a mental battle.
Yeah.
I'm still cursing, and I'm still saying, I can't believe this stupid little thing that happened at jiu-jitsu is causing me to have this level of pain.
Yeah.
And I'm doing I can't believe I'm going to be out of jiu-jitsu for 5 months, because literally at this point, I thought it was a 5-month recovery.
Yeah,
so I'm still at that.
And I was in a really similar state. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm having flashbacks, by the way.
Yeah. So all that stuff's still going through my mind. And, how do you know you're on the right track? You have to just understand that in that moment, there's 2 things you want to be thinking about. One, you have to assess everything you do, because your assessments will tell you the truth and you can follow that.
Mm-hmm.
You can't necessarily expect miracles from these little interventions in an acute stage, because when you're in an acute stage, your nervous system is very sensitive, right? It's very sensitive. So, but if you're finding little interventions that are helping move the needle in the right direction, reducing pain, allowing you better freedom of movement, you are on the right track. You just have to keep doing more of that.
Yeah.
Okay. So about it was either the third or the fourth day, I was like, okay, what else can I throw at this thing? We're doing the red light somewhat consistently now. Still got the knee circles going. I'm now trying other mobility drills too, just to kind of deal with the overall stiffness. Doing some stuff for my feet, my ankles, my hips, because honestly, now I'm starting to feel like I'm getting tight and achy in other areas from not moving and from hobbling around. Because when your gait cycle changes, the poor mechanics that you're using can take a toll on you. So now I'm getting like lower back stiffness, and I'm like, oh man, now I'm really starting to feel like an injured person.
Yeah, everything's misaligned. Your body's compensating in weird ways. You're using muscles or contracting things that you wouldn't normally.
This kind of brings us to this final stage, and honestly, where some of the magic happens that still in this moment is very surprising to me, because I did have an extremely fast recovery once I found this next key piece. So I was starting to get sore in other areas of my body, but I would actually say it was inappropriate. So my lower back was getting sore, but it got too sore. Okay. I started getting sore and achiness in my hips that I did expect, but it was too much. It's like, what is going on here? I then started to get sore and achiness kind of in my shoulders and neck region. And I was like, this is a little extreme. I do think that can happen when your gait gets changed and now you're kind of suffering from not moving as much as you want to because you have this injury. But I really felt like for me, something was up. It was a little bit too much. So where did my mind go in terms of a tool set that we could possibly call on? That made me think of the lymph system, because your lymphatic system, if you want to think about it like this, it's kind of the sewer system of your body for processing fluids and waste. And a large part of your lymph system is underneath the skin. So it's actually quite superficial. And oftentimes what happens is when your body is struggling to process waste and your lymph system gets backed up or stagnant, as we might say, your muscles respond to that reflexively and you can become stiff and achy. And so I actually felt like I was starting to have a lymph response a little bit more globally that told me, oh, my body seems to be struggling with dealing with this inflammation a little bit, because now I'm getting this kind of inflammatory feeling elsewhere in my body. What tools can I start to apply to this? And when we think about lymph tools, there's hands-on things we can do. I mentioned the kinesio tape, which was something I was going to do, but I was putting it off for as long as possible because I didn't want to shave my legs. My leg, because it's a pain in the ass. So in the back of my mind, I was like, all right, I could do some a lymph kinesio tape job, and it works so good. But I was like, I don't want to shave my leg because it's just such a pain. Have you considered
waxing?
So I was like, what can I do before it's time to shave my right leg? So for lymph work, we want to think mobility. We want to think hands-on type stuff. We want to think breathing, because breathing is actually one of the best ways to mobilize the lymph system when you combine it with some kind of lymphatic technique. So for me, it had to be something I could do on myself, right? It had to be something I could figure out how to do. And I have a couple of good lymph drainage techniques that I teach people how to do on themselves. One of them, and I didn't do this one, I didn't have to because the thing I'll describe in a minute was so effective, I stuck with that. But one of them is if you take like a kettlebell or some kind of weight of fairly significant weight. It could be like a sandbag. Generally, it has to be at least 30 pounds. And you can put the weight on top of a towel. And there are some areas that I teach people to palpate on their own body around their clavicle region. And by applying the weight on that area, you can start to promote some drainage of the lymph system very globally, because that part of the lymph system is very accessible, because it's you can affect it by actually palpating in that area.
And palpating means
You could either do it with your hands if you had somebody to do it for you, or in this case, when I teach people how to do this on their own, that's what we're using the kettlebell for, is to put that weight on that pec clavicle area. And then I teach them how to just kind of traction it generally outward a little bit. So it's pressing into your body, and then you traction it a little bit out. So it's kind of pulling the skin.
So it's like you're pushing it to the side, but it's still gripping the skin. You're
You
not
got
just
it.
sliding it.
Yeah,
Okay.
gripping's the key word there.
Yeah.
That's great. And that can be really effective at helping to promote some movement of that stagnant lymph system, but we generally stack it with movement and breathing. So, for example, let's say you had like an ankle sprain and you wanted to do something that might help the inflammation. You could use this technique while at the same time doing some very simple ankle circles and focusing on breathing, or maybe even doing breathing exercises in between sets of the mobility drill. So it's kind of a combination of movement, breathing, and then this tactile type of stimulus that can be good for promoting the lymphatic drainage. So that's one idea. It's a little bit more involved. What I thought in my mind was, okay, if I need to do that, I will, but can I construct an active mobilization and stack it with breathing? And the way that I would think about that is the position I need to get my body into has to create some kind of tensional, like a stretch, I guess we would call it, because you want to stretch the skin. Remember how we said the lymphatic system is quite superficial, so beneath the skin. So we need some level of skin traction, right? And we can combine that with movement and breathing. And so I got into a position that resembled a standing hip flexor stretch. And if you can imagine like a hip flexor stretch, meaning I put my, in this case, my right leg behind me. I actually internally rotated it, drove my heel down into the ground. So now I'm starting to feel a stretch on the front of my hip, kind of in a lunge position. Then what I do with my upper body is I extend back. I bend to my left, so away from my target side, and then I rotate toward the target side. And so what I've essentially done is put a gentle stretch on the front of the hip, or some people might say it kind of feels like almost like a psoas stretch, right? One of your hip flexors there. And I felt this stretch down the front of my hip and inside of my thigh, all the way down to where my MCL is on the inside of my knee. Once I got into the position, I did some deep breathing, and I was trying to breathe into my hip crease, which is where that big grouping of lymph nodes lives. Now, am I really breathing into my hip? No, but the awareness and the intention to breathe into the hip creates some movement in that area, particularly in like the lower quadrant of my abdomen.
Yeah.
And I did some deep breathing there. Also did some diaphragm stretches. So that's one of our famous breathing drills where you just force an exhale out and get a nice mobilization of the diaphragm. So movement combined with stretch, combined with breathing, and it was all targeted to that kind of line of the body where I was feeling the stiffness and the pain.
Real quick, just to nerd out for a second. Are you doing breathing in like a long, slow kind of way? Are you trying to like parasympathetic breathe?
Yeah.
Or
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. So it was nasal breathing. So in through the nose, out through the nose, fairly slow, and just kind of trying to relax, but hold that stretch position. And I actually also timed the breathing, or synchronized the breathing with some pulsing of the movement. So like with one of those little movements of the trunk, like the rotation, I would kind of try to breathe, maybe exhale in a pulsing type of
Yeah.
coordinated way. It felt very nice. It felt very rhythmic, trying to stay relaxed in all other areas of my body. And I did that for, say, 20 to 30 seconds at a time. So I come out of the first set of this, and my knee pain goes from an 8 to a 1. And I was like, damn, here we go. Like there's always a tool. There's always a tool in the toolbox that is going to help. I always tell people that. It doesn't matter what you've tried, because everyone says the same thing. Everyone says the same exact thing. I've tried everything. There's always a stimulus that's going to help. That's why I love teaching people how to think through these issues more, because when you know what pain is and where it comes from, because it's a construct of your brain, and you know that pain does not necessarily dictate or relate in any way to the severity of the actual injury, just understanding that education can kind of calm you down enough to be more strategic in your thinking. And if you have different tools and you understand, when to pull those tools from the toolbox, you can think through it kind of like I did, where it's like, all right, well, let's try some movement. Let's try some passive, red light therapy, some e-stim, some compression. This didn't help. I'm not going with that. This did help. I'm adding that to my routine. Well, I'm starting to get more of what feels like an inflammatory response in my whole body. Well, now we have to start thinking about dealing with what's now starting to feel more systemic. And I would do that with lymph work. So here we are now at this seemingly simple looking hip flexor stretch that's combined with pulsing movement and breathing. And we've just essentially designed our own way of lymphatic drainage. So pain goes from an 8 to a 1, and I'm like, all right, this is awesome. I start walking to test, because gait cycle is going to be your ultimate test. It's one thing to put weight on it and bend it a little bit. If you get results, great. That's still very important. But as soon as you start to walk and you feel improvement in your gait, now you've done something really good. Because as all of your systems work in an integrated way, and you do something like move through the world, that is a much more specific assessment and tells you that you can have confidence in the fact that you are now really on the right track.
Yeah, this can help you avoid the table effect, right? It's like,
Yes.
oh, this feels better when I'm lying down, but as soon as I get up and do something, it's back to exactly where it was.
Exactly. That's so important, because, and sometimes, especially in an acute stage, it's perfectly okay and still really good news to do something passively, get off the table, or, stand back up and walk off the result in a short amount of time. That's still not bad news in an acute stage, because it's part of the process. Remember, in an acute stage, your nervous system is just so sensitive. It's not in your brain's best interest to give you great freedom of movement. It would rather use these protective outputs to try to create safety. Right? With chronic pain, that's a different scenario. The table dilemma is very important, because if you're walking off the intervention within a matter of minutes, what that's telling you is that what you're doing on the table is non-specific to how you're going to use your body moving through the world. And we need to do better than that. And that's when we start thinking more position specific for those interventions. So yeah, I test this. It's great news. Pain from an 8 to a 1. Gait is better. Mobility is better. And so easiest thing to do at this point is I'm going to do that exercise every 15 minutes. And that's essentially what I did. And by the second day, this was now around the third or fourth day, I woke up after doing that day of multiple bouts of this lymphatic drill.
Every 15 minutes?
Every 15
for the
minutes.
whole day?
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, some were missed, right?
Yeah.
It is what it is. Like, the point is, I did it a lot. I would just stop, get into the stretch position, find the position, get the breathing going, spend 15 seconds to maybe 30 seconds doing that, and then go on with my day. The next morning when I woke up, that pain was like a 2. So I'd gone from waking up at like an 8 out of 10. That pain is now at a 2. And I say to my wife, wow, this is not a 3-month recovery. I can't believe it. this might be a 3-week recovery. So it's amazing to me because it's one of those examples of how pain is not always the overriding factor that tells you what kind of damage you've done.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not. And so at that point, I was like, gosh, I guess that's what's going on here. Like I had a little bit of an extreme response to what happened, and now we're really decreasing perceived threat that's associated with that. Here we go. I'm just going to keep doing it. And within a matter of days from that point, I was pain-free. And so we're talking within a week from the sprain, I'm good to go. I'm working out again with no thought of my knee. However, the thing I will say is at that point, and for the next 2 weeks, I still was not ready to do jujitsu. I drilled, I went to class, I didn't live wrestle because of the unpredictable nature of that.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like I felt 98%. There was still that little bit, that lack of confidence where if I moved a certain way or someone hit my leg similarly to that initial injury position, that was not going to be a good thing. And it kind of reminded me a few times when I was drilling with my partner on a Saturday class. As soon as the speed picked up and my leg was in an open chain position and relaxed, that ligament would get loaded. I'd get a little discomfort, and it was a reminder, hey, buddy, don't be stupid today and live wrestle. Walk out of here when everybody starts doing that. And so that's what I did. And now I have not gone back to live wrestling yet because I actually wasn't able to train last weekend. But now we're about 3 weeks past when I had the initial injury, and I'm good to go, dude. Like, I do not think about it. There is no problem there.
Yeah, that's amazing. Do keep us posted. So a question that comes to mind is the body is going to be healing on its own, right? Like people get injured all the time. They heal all the time. It's kind of impossible to know what your injury would have looked like had you not done any of these interventions, right?
Right.
But you did assessments and you noticed some changes immediately after, especially that breathing and hip stretch lymphatic movement. Let's just paint a picture of the opposite scenario. They're not doing any movement. They put it in a brace. They kept it elevated. They took anti-inflammatories. They iced it. And they got crutches, and they just stayed off of it for however long the doctor said, let's say 2 weeks.
Sure.
What can happen to the body in that scenario that may actually prolong the injury? I know this is such a leading question, but we've talked about it in other episodes, but I just kind of want to paint that opposite scenario picture for people.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is it's a massive disruption to how much activation you're getting neurologically, how much brain activation. And you're not going to be able to deal with the fluids or the inflammation as well if you're not moving, because movement is kind of that built-in anti-inflammatory system. So if you're just immobilizing yourself and you're sitting on the couch doing the whole rice, as they say, you're really doing yourself a disservice if you can move. And when I mean move, I realize that sometimes it's not the right idea to move the injured area because you don't want to exacerbate your pain, but you can still move other parts of your body. And that's where you have to get creative. It's a very difficult situation to be in because at that point, a lot of people get so bogged down with kind of the feelings of depression that come with an injury.
Yeah.
They often don't want to take that step to start to move in some way. And nobody likes to regress what they're doing so much because they're injured.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really tough position to be in. And then, of course, the average person, if we're talking about the general population, doesn't actually know. They haven't been educated in a way. They don't know that they should actually move. They think it's going to be dangerous. Because remember, this person does not have the education about pain.
Yeah.
They don't know pain comes from your brain, and the experience is being constructed on so many other factors. So they think that if they move, they might damage themselves more, or they're associating pain with damage. And yes, they can come together. But for example, like in my case, the pain I had told me I was out for 5 months.
Mm-hmm.
The reality for me with that particular injury, that again was not super serious, but the reality was I was going to be in some pain for a week, right? And so my nervous system and my brain told me a different story at the beginning. And then as I started to go through the process, that whole idea changed.
Yeah, so this is a great case study of what you did with this very specific MCL
Yeah.
sprain. And I think it's a wealth of information. And I hope people are taking notes because there's just so much there
Hmm.
that you can take and apply. I'm kind of curious, just from like a more general statement, like
Hmm.
you're injured somewhere.
Hmm.
Is the first thing to do like what you did, which is figure out how you can move it
Yeah. Yeah.
and
So,
then assess, and then what's
yeah.
your roadmap in general?
Yeah. That thought process that I went through with my knee, I feel like could be applied to any injury, any part of the body. The whole thing here, though, is it is going to come down to the severity of what you actually have going on. And that's why there are going to be instances where you have to seek out a medical professional to understand what actually happened. Because for me, like I keep saying, it wasn't that serious of an injury. If I had to guess, it was a low grade sprain.
Mm-hmm.
Very different from 7 years ago when I actually partially tore my MCL. And that was a true 5 to 6 month full recovery.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is going to be based on getting an opinion, right? That can always be a very useful thing at the beginning, and working from there. Because after that, you kind of have to start to be the authority on your own body, and you have to assess and reassess different things and understand what's helping you and what's not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a much better process than just sitting on the couch or in bed, laying, completely laid up, thinking, well, I'm going to let time pass until things heal. There's always something that you can do. And even if it doesn't feel super targeted to the area that's causing you the pain, it's still very productive to move and do the things that you can. But you made me think of one thing, Tony, that I wanted to mention. So if this had gone differently, and rather than this being kind of a low grade sprain, it was more serious, the first thing I actually would have done is I would have gotten in the water. Okay. So you've heard me going way back to actually one of our first podcasts together. I talked about the Burdenko method,
Mm-hmm.
which is it's a Russian system of both training, it's conditioning and rehab, really. And it is both a land and water-based system. So there's land exercises and there are water exercises. And to kind of paint this picture, the rehab portion of it that's done in the water can be done in the shallow end, but often it's done in the deep end, and you wear flotation. So you would put flotation around your waist, and depending on the exercise that you're doing, you might have like a foam barbell in each hand that is also providing buoyancy. And when you get into the deep water and you have buoyancy, it allows you to relax as you're kind of floating vertically often in the water. That's a big part of the program, is to actually float vertically so that the exercises you're practicing are done in alignment, right? The same kind of alignment we would use standing on land. Now it's different because you have buoyancy and you're not standing on land, but the position is similar.
Mm-hmm.
And you go through various exercises. It is a wonderful medium for acute injury. I mean, if my injury was worse than it was, that would have been the first thing that I would have done the next day, is get in the water, because the water and the viscosity and the hydrostatic pressure of water pushes against your body and provides resistance to work against, but also gives you a sense of joint stability. It essentially supports you as you move.
It's a compression
Yes.
of its own, yeah.
Yeah, so you remember the compression wrap idea?
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we're doing that with our whole body. So water as a medium for acute injury is great because you promote movement of a static lymph system. You decompress in a sense because even though gravity is still present, you have buoyancy working with you. And it allows you to relax to some degree because now you have the hydrostatic pressure that's essentially supportive. So you're moving through this 3-dimensional mobile cast. And as the water deflects around your body, there's improved circulation and it just feels good.
Hmm.
So it's an amazing medium for acute injury. And had I had a worse injury, that would have been the first place that I would go. It really helps deal with inflammation. It really helps take the achiness out of joints after an injury. It's fantastic stuff. I've used it many times myself with lots of athletes in the past dealing with injuries. It is the first place to go if you have a more serious injury that moving on land is actually too dangerous. It's not a good starting point. Moving in water is better.
Yeah, if you can't load that joint through the chain, through gravity, then floating in the water allows you to move it without that load.
Totally. And it just comes with so many other benefits. And you could literally do an entire rehab phase. If you were recovering from a more serious injury, surgery has become tough because it depends, right? You can't just jump in the pool after having surgery because you have an incision. So you have to wait until you're cleared for that. And sometimes you can cover them up in a way that makes them watertight and you're good to go. But post-surgery, post-injury, it's so good to do the first stage of your rehab in the water. And then slowly you progress to the shallow end. Now you're dealing with a little bit more of your body weight, a little less buoyancy, a little bit more gravity. And then from there, you progress to land-based exercises.
It's so cool to see kind of the through lines between all these protocols. And the two things that I'm really getting from this are you want to promote movement of the joint, and that works on several levels, but movement of the injury allows to help with inflammation, with dealing with the fluids, but it also keeps your movement box bigger.
Yes.
And that goes to the second thing, which is you want to do things that reduce threat. So the compression, the parasympathetic breathing, it's all stuff that's designed to kind of make your body say, oh, it's actually okay. Like I can move my knee and I'm not falling apart. So maybe I can dial the pain down a little bit and grant you a little bit more movement. And so between those two things, there's lots of tools to get there between tractioning the skin and compression and movement. You're kind of dialing those two factors. Does that sound...
Love it. It's a great summary.
Right?
Yeah, man, It's a great summary. That's awesome. Reduce perceived threat initially and assess everything that you're doing so that you actually know what's helping you and what's not. And understand that your body's response to the things that you're trying is the truth. Your nervous system will tell you the truth, whether or not it's helping you or possibly even harming you, right? Pain can increase with the wrong intervention. That's a very real thing. We make the mistake so often of assuming that anything we do that's supposed to be healthy is the right thing for us. And it's just not the case. That's why the cornerstone of my existence as a coach really always comes back full circle to, hey, let's assess this in some way so that we can actually understand whether or not this is the right idea at present.
Yeah, that's great.
All right, there it is, Tony. Thank you to our listeners. I hope you like that piece on accelerated recovery strategies should you have bad luck like I did and get injured. So this would be a really good time to tell you guys that we have some exciting stuff coming up. Keep your eyes and ears peeled because we're going to be releasing a new course after the new year. And this is going to be a really exciting course for us to put together because it is essentially going to be a stepping stone to our Neuro Dojo, meaning if you are a health or movement professional and you're wanting to get into applied neurology so that you can help your clients faster and have a whole new tool set to do so and to add to what you're already doing, this is going to be the course for you. This is essentially a foundations course that's going to set you up for what's to come after that with the Neuro Dojo. So stay tuned for all of that. We're going to be talking more about it in the weeks to come. Thank you all for listening, and we will be back very soon. Peace out.